Hey guys, what's up? Today is 74, my daily quarantine vlogging challenge. Now, we're doing pretty good. Can you imagine that? We're one step away from being 3/4 of 100 days, which is math. Hello. But I thought, I've been having a lot of fun. I believe yesterday I did a reading vlog, and a few days ago I did an entertainment, kind of corner. And so I thought, it is ripe time to do another False Bullsies 1, 2, 3 Weeb corner. And you're like, wow, Ryan, you're such a fucking weeb. You've watched like 5 anime. And I'm just like, yeah, I know. But, I like talking about anime, I like talking about manga, and so I thought it's fun, something that's fun to do. And so I initially was going to choose 5 anime that made me like sob like a little bitch baby. But I could only think of like 2 of those, so I'm like, okay, I gotta like work with something else, because apparently I don't cry enough. I know, how dare I? How dare I not sob absolute buckets over everything, little thing? I know, I can't stand myself either. And so I decided, I looked at it another way. I'm just like, we gotta figure something else out. And so I'm thinking, and I'm pondering, the smoke's rising, and I figured it out. I'm thinking, what if I just talked about like all these dark and edgy animes I watch? Because I love horror, and I also have watched a few horror anime. Now, I haven't like watched all the good shit that people talk about with the vampires and the zombies and the other bullshits. But I've seen a few pretty interesting thriller slash horror slash dark fantasy style shows, and I thought I might as well mention them. So this is 5 dark and edgy anime that like you can watch or whatever. So let's start. Number 1. That's going to be Erased. Don't remember who made it because honestly, I don't give a shit about producers. That's not true, but it's like, I don't know who makes anime. It just shows up on my Crunchyroll and I put it in my brain hole. And so what is Erased about? Essentially, Erased is essentially this kind of time-traveling crime thriller. And you're like, oh, woo, what the fuck does that mean? So you follow this guy, basically, and he remembers witnessing, or at least being a witness, to the events leading to a classmate's death. And, way back when he was, 5 or something. And so, he's living his best life until these murders are up again that are very reminiscent of the death of his friend. Also, his mom dies, which is not a spoiler since it happens, in the first freaking episode. And he's basically, on one hand, running away from the police because he's a suspect in his mother's death. And on the other hand, somehow transported, his consciousness is sent back in time to when he was a little kid. And he's essentially given a second chance to solve the murder or prevent the murder of his, classmate. And so, he becomes friends with her, and he basically is trying to, figure out how to stop her from dying, because he has the knowledge of, a 20-year-old man inside the body of, a 6-year-old boy. Or whenever they were, they were young, It was, maybe they were 8. Who knows? I'm bad with children's ages. But they were small childs. And so, pretty much, they're trying to figure all this stuff out. So on one hand, you have this, modern, I guess, intrigue, drama aspect, where, he's basically trying to, find, he's sort of, he's on the run, he's, fugitive, couldn't think of the word, but, in the past, he's basically trying to do with, these sort of, almost time shenanigans, because he's experienced this all before, and so he's trying for the better timeline, where, his friend doesn't die. Things that work really good in this show is, I guess, plot, basically, because you have to have a good plot for a time travel show, and cinematography especially. One of the things that interested me in this show a lot was Mother's Basement's commentary on the cinematography of the show, and he really gets into a lot of the framing of it, which was really fascinating. I love discussions of film theory and cinematography in television, and so I really enjoy hearing about that. So there's some really good, I guess, if you're the type of bitch like me that just loses the frickin' nut over, I guess, just really good cinematography or just really good, I guess, cinema as an art form, you'll like Erased. My only complaint with the series is pretty much just the ending. I felt the ending really pulled its punch a bit. It didn't work in a way that I particularly enjoyed. I felt that it was very rushed, and I felt that the payoff, while the twist was, because obviously there's a twist, it's a thriller, was good. It just was not as satisfying as I hoped it would be given the build-up. Still a good show, but I wasn't super happy with the ending. And that's that. Next up, number 2 is another horror thriller called Erased. And this was really good. So basically imagine Final Destination, the anime. But like, yeah. And so I first heard about it, first got exposed to it, mostly when I was being a fucking weeb on the internet, and watching anime crack videos. Basically, you just take vines, you put it over some anime, they go, oh, we want Ochinchin Gadesaka Nandeyo, and you're like, ha ha ha, that's funny, here's my like. If you want to know what anime crack I usually watch, usually Anime Brain, I believe, is the YouTube channel that I usually watch for that stuff, but I haven't watched one of the videos in forever. But pretty much, I would be, watching these, short little, clips of all these, funny anime things. And, so we'd just be, walking along. We just, die horribly. And then it would be just, dun dun. This is what it feels like to chew 5 gum. Or just, something, silly and meme-ish like that. And you're like, that looks cool. And it was just these really visceral sort of, death scenes that were just really captivating. And I'm just like, that looks fucked up. I want to watch it. And then I did. And so what's Erased about? Pretty much there's this guy, he moves to a place in Japan that has a name that I don't know because I don't remember. And basically, there's this quiet girl, she got an eye patch. I mean, he's like, well, that's weird. And other people, none of the students or the teachers acknowledge her. And he's like, wow, that's some straight up neglect. And so it's like, yo, bitch, why nobody talking to you? And she's like, well, let me tell you a story, okay? Pretty much, there was this chick a long time ago in the 80s, and she died. And, but all the students were like, yep, she's still alive. Let's say her name. That doesn't, definitely have any issues and, causing ghosts. Because if there's one thing I know about Japanese mythology, is that pretty much anything can become a ghost. You accidentally leave your shoes out on the porch, one day, they're gonna be fucking ghosts. You're gonna have some shoes haunting your ass because you were a lazy son of a bitch. And that's all I know about Japanese mythology. Feel free to roast me and call me, some sort of, horrible person in the comments. But pretty much, this, the classroom gets cursed because of this. And so people start dying. And so they figure out, we made Japan, we worked it out. We just pretend that one child does not exist and that she's a dead person. And because of that, the ghost won't murder anyone. And they're just like, that's some top noggin thinking. Okay. And so basically she's the odd woman out. And no one talks to her unless or somebody's going to die. But guess what? This bitch been talking to her this entire time. And now peeps be dying. And so pretty much Final Destination shenanigans starts happening. And you get all these really gruesome moiters. And it's just... it's zesty. You get another great aspect for another was just, it's very atmospheric. It's very creepy. You get all this creepy shit that you're like, why is this here? But it also has some really interesting character designs and just a really great third act. Pretty much the third, or I guess the middle of the second act. Because if I remember correctly, third act is specifically the denouement and I guess falling action. But basically up to the climax of the series is just, it's so fucking good. The big rising action of the show, when things so the horror movie element where everyone's dying really quickly, that. Just, chef's kiss, fucking beautiful, love it. Just watch the show, it's good. And yeah, it's good. So let's move on because I have nothing else to say about that. School Lives, number 3. And so it's a teensy bit of a spoiler, considering that this is called 5 Dark and Edgy Anime. But School Lives is a dark and edgy anime. But Ryan, why would that be a spoiler? We know nothing about this because you have knowledge that we don't, and that's why we're watching this video. Basically, School Lives follows the story of 4 girls who live in the School Live Club, which is a club where they live at the school. Well, Ryan, that sounds weird, and not above board, and you're absolutely right. Because, and this is some spoilers, so don't, watch this until, I talk about something else. Basically, it's during the zombie apocalypse. And the reason why that's a spoiler is because the show initially starts in the first episode as this very cutesy, very Moe Blob style show. And you think, oh, it's just cute girls doing cute things. But then you're like, oh, well, guess it. It's actually involving visceral horror. Yep. It's all them cute girls, but instead of I don't know, making tiramisu and having water balloon fights, I don't actually know what people do in Moe shows. They pretty much just chop the heads off zombies who were their former classmates. And that is grade A horrifying. So, School Lies is just great because it has that sort of cutesy aesthetic, but then it's just like, nope, fuck you, we're just going to traumatize some girls today. And so, there's a very visceral, emotional reaction to the show. It's gonna break your heart. It's gonna put you on the edge of your seat. And as, zombie shows go, it's much more psychological horror than power fantasy. And I feel like zombie shows can definitely be one of those two camps. Sometimes zombie, things will be very power fantasy. It's all about, shooting down zombies and being successful and surviving. And you get that sort of independence through survival. But then there's also oopsie daisy, people are dying around me and I just watched my mom chew off my dad's face. And you're like, that's gonna be some emotional trauma. And so School Lies is just really good because of its tone, because of its plot setting, and also the use of an unreliable narrator and having her character arc be, or essentially coming to terms with the brutality of the world that she lives in. And so, it's good. It also has, one thing that's really interesting is its opening sequence essentially changes throughout the series. It starts off super cutesy, and then it gets fucked up. And you're like, that's right, we love it. Another show that was dealing with zombie apocalypse that actually had a similar sort of progression between sort of clean to just filthy was actually Black Summer. That's one of the things I really loved about the series, and that you basically got to see every scuff and dent of the apocalypse as the series progressed. I don't know if I've ever finished that show though, so I'll have to rewatch because it was fantastic. Anyway, let's move on. Number 4 is going to be Death Parade. How to think about the name of it. So Death Parade, I think I talked about it before on my channel, but I can't quite remember. But I felt it definitely would fit into the style. And Death Parade is essentially the story about this arbiter who is essentially determining whether or not a person should go to heaven or hell. They don't use those terms, but that's basically the equivalency. Shangri-La or the or whatever, have you. The good place or the bad place. And essentially it's all dealing with souls in the afterlife. And so it's a really interesting sort of metaphysical sort of story. And so what the show does really well is it has some really interesting character, studies, both in the sort of patrons that come to the sort of testing place, but also in the arbiters. And basically it's set up so that the judge of your soul is your bartender. And it's you want to play some parlor games? And they're just I don't remember when I got on this elevator, but sure, we're here at Hotel California. And so basically it deals a lot with, I guess, sort of just the depths of humanity and the depravity that we face when confronted with an absolute fear, sort of morality, and what we will do in a situation that we find unsustainable. And also there's a lot of other sort of shit. It's really a show that's kind of trying to break down the human condition, and it does it, I think, well. Some things I really love is just sort of the aesthetics of it. It's such a very visually appealing show, while also still having some very great moments of visceral horror. I think one thing that anime does really well, or it can do really well, is essentially having very strong expressionism, especially in people's faces. And so generally that usually has either very extreme, and so basically you can show very intense emotions in anime that you might not be able to with less stylized animated styles. For instance, let's go with CGI, just a bit out the Miraculous Ladybug, right? CGI, you have those models. They have good expressionism, but they'd never be able to reach the level of expressionism that would be done in a traditionally hand-drawn, cartoon, just because of the ability to exaggerate the style, where in CGI that would not be possible. But let's move on from that. And so basically the visual style is very distinct. The world building is probably one of the best elements of the show as well. Out of all the shows I'm mentioning, Death Parade is probably like one of the nicest like built worlds in there. Honestly, I wish they spent more time building the world in, I guess, Death Parade, just because it was so fascinating of a place. It's definitely something that I wish had to like more than one season. It's definitely something that like I would watch a full length like live action show of it, though. Probably the live action probably will definitely take away from sort of the impact of the show itself. And it's a really interesting show that deals with things like, morality and life and all these other things. And it's also super fucking sad. This show made me cry. So you got one show that made me cry. The other show was Violet Evergarden, but that's not dark and edgy, so it didn't make the cut. And yeah, just watch it. The next up, and this is probably my favorite show on the list. I liked all of these, but this is definitely my favorite, and this one actually does have 2 seasons, which is just fantastic. And that's ReZero. ReZero is basically dark fantasy Groundhog's Day. And you're like, ooh, what do you mean? So basically, you're living your best life with Mr. Subaru. He's a bit of a neat. And the next thing you know, he blinks a blinks. He doesn't get hit by Trucksama because, he's not that cool. He just blinks his eyes a couple times, clears the dust, and he's like, oh, woo, what am I, in some fantasy world? How'd that happen? Oh, by the way, this is an isekai show. If you don't know, isekai refers to a specific version of portal fantasy, where essentially characters usually shut-ins or neats, which is a Japanese term, which don't really have a lot of, I guess, life here on Earth. They generally go to some medieval fantasy realm, and usually get bitches. A lot of isekai ones are harem shows, though there are other ones which deal with psychological horror, like SAO, which, while it is heavily panned for many good reasons, was a very novel concept when it came out, at least in my opinion. But anyway, let's get on with it. So ReZero is actually considered a deconstruction of the isekai genre. For one thing, Subaru's, I guess, magical, cool boy abilities don't really show up later into, I guess, the episode specifically, but he has a very passive skill. Still, the skill is very powerful when used, over and over again, but I will get into what I mean by that. So essentially, he doesn't, immediately go there and know the language and be able to understand everything and basically get a bevy of hot bitches for no reason. There is somewhat of a harem, though another deconstruction of it is that while he has many, many attractive women in his life, he only got the hots for one of them. And so that's actually really nice that even though there are waifus, there is not necessarily a harem, so to speak. So essentially those 2 main things, essentially the power fantasy element of it and the general harem tropes which are present in isekai animes, are deconstructed through to Subaru's version of those tropes. Another great element is its dark fantasy, though there are comedic elements in the show. And essentially, Subaru dies a lot. And you're like, how does a person die? A lot. That's not a thing that happens. Well, you see, he got some Groundhog Day power bullshit. Every time he dies, he gets ripped back to essentially a respawn point. So by the time that I actually had finished the show, but in season 3, he essentially has had about 3 story arcs in which he's essentially stopped dying so much. But he dies a good bit. Probably not as much as Bill Murray, but he dies a good bit. And a lot of the times it's very, very violent and very, very bloody. And so a lot of him trying to understand this world, which has a very complex political structure, and there's a lot of intrigue elements in the story, which is just wonderful. We do love a good intrigue plot. There's also a lot of really fascinating world building that he has to basically come to terms with to keep from just dying horribly over and over and over again. Some elements that make Subaru work as a character is essentially his devotion and loyalty as a character, and also his persistence, because he has to basically solve these things. And I think those he's really well built as a character because his persistences and doggedness is not only commented on and dealt with as a flaw at times, but it also is allowed to be something that he deals with that bothers other people and sometimes doesn't bother other people. And so it is a complex part of his personality. But at the same time, he's never so dogged that it overwhelms the plot, with other sort of shonen protagonists who are less like, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna be the best bitch, and then they just seem like a yappy dog and you don't love them anymore. Subaru got some personality and we stan. Another great element is that basically there is a really nice love triangle that happens in the story that is actually surprisingly wholesome. Pretty much Subaru likes this chick named Emily, and she kind of knows it, but like, she has her own shit to deal with, and she just doesn't want to make out with a dude right now. And I'm like, okay, honey, you do you. But then there's also Best Girl, whose name is Rem, who's just freaking awesome. She also has a twin, but Ram can go fuck herself. And Rem is just, she's Best Girl. She's just like, hey boy, like, I kind of want to smooch that face. And he's just like, I like Emily, and she's just like, oh, okay. And so she just still hangs around and surprisingly finds a lot of occasions to shove his face in her tits. But that's anime for you. And I'm just like, honey, he ain't for that, so maybe you shouldn't do that. But like, it's some good comic relief, I guess. Like, that's really the only part where we're just like, maybe not. But basically, what really works for the story is just really great world building, a lot of really interesting and deconstructed fantasy tropes, and specifically deconstruction of isekai, which can be very, very trite at times. So the fact that ReZero really manages to have a very fresh take on the isekai format is just so nice. Because, like, we've been watching all this bullshit, like, Lost in Another World of My Smartphone. That's trash. ReZero, that's class. Anyway, now that I've stopped roasting animes that are not part of, this conversation, that's pretty much what I got for you. There's 5 animes. You can watch them. You cannot watch them. Honestly, I don't give a fucking shit. You can do what the hell you want. Did you know, if you live in America, this is a free country? Though, given that expression, aren't most countries free countries? That is a really good experiment that we should have some other time that is not today and not right this very second. But you're your own person. You are presumably an adult or a child that can make their own decisions. So whether or not you want to watch these animes are completely up to you. Agency! Anyway, guys, don't have much else to say. I got a fuck ton of editing to do because honestly, I have no life and I never do. So I'm gonna get on that. So, wash your hands. Tell your loved ones you love them. Just try to live your best life. Do something for yourself and be better every single day of your life. Because if you don't do it today, you ain't going to do it tomorrow. I know you. You are not going to do it tomorrow. So, live your best life. Anyway, guys, this is False Bulls 123 and I'm signing off. I have a bruise right here. Yay.